before we get started, we have a quick little presentation. We just wanted to recognize somebody who has been a dedicated volunteer to the Wetland Professional Association. She was previously a board member many years ago, and since being a board member, she has been continuing to volunteer, sending out mass amounts of information for us on a somewhat weekly basis, it seems like lately. And so, in recognition of that, we wanted to present Natasha DuBois with a lifetime membership to the Wetland Professional Association. She wasn't expecting this, so. All right, and so today we have Tamara Cameron, Des Morningstar, and Tim Smith from the Corps of Engineers, and they are going to be speaking about the effects of the sequester from last year, proposed Clean Water Act rule, and the water of the U.S. new definition. We're going to have, since we have a slightly larger audience today than normal, we have some note cards for questions if anybody wants to write down a question. And just raise your hand, we'll pick them up, and then we'll read them after. That'll probably work the smoothest. So, without further ado, it's Tamara here.
Well, thanks very much to Allison for allowing me a chance to speak today. I don't want to have interference. Oh, that's on purpose, right? Because if I stand over there, there's interference. If I stand over here, I'm on camera, and there's no interference. That's very smart. Well, I hope I can share some information with you today that will be helpful to you in serving your clients or your constituents, whichever the case may be. Just like to take a little time to cover some basic information about the Corps mission and authorities, provide a brief comparison of preliminary jurisdictional determinations and approved jurisdictional determinations, the role of EPA at headquarters in reviewing certain JVs that we do, and the associated steps and the review timeframes for that. And finally, I'd like to talk about our current permit processing timeframes and provide some recommendations for moving through that process smoothly.
Anna?
Yes.
Can you hold the mic a little bit closer?
Yes. Is that better? Is that better volume? Okay. Yeah. It's up pretty loud, which might be interference. So I just want to take a moment to cover our mission. The underlying and overriding purpose of the Corps regulatory mission is to preserve the integrity of the nation's waters while allowing reasonable economic development. And I'd like to think that many of you are in the profession you're in because you'd also like to preserve the aquatic ecosystem and achieve what we would like to achieve, which is a high-functioning aquatic environment that exists in harmony with the communities that they support. So, our role and authority, I'm sure you're all familiar, the two main authorities are Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. All of our permit decisions are considered major federal actions. They're subject to the National Environmental Policy Act. We have two other substantive reviews. They are the public interest review and compliance with the 404 guidelines. Those are both pass-fail tests. You must pass them to get a permit. Okay, so there's a whole host of regulations, policies, and executive orders that we have to follow. First and foremost is obviously Section 404. As I mentioned, National Environmental Policy Act. Every single permit we issue has an underlying analysis to satisfy NEPA. We have also, you're required to get either a waiver or certification from the state or a tribe, depending on where your project is, under Section 401. And then, of course, there is Endangered Species Act compliance, there's historic property compliance. I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with all of these requirements? Yes? Yes? Okay. And then a bunch of executive orders on things like environmental justice, floodplain management, invasive species. They all have to be complied with in our permit decisions. Okay, so JDs, jurisdictional determinations. I wanted to talk about this today because there might be some questions about sometimes why it takes us so long to make decisions about jurisdiction. Well, preliminary JDs are just that, they're preliminary. Does anybody want to share what they see as an advantage of a preliminary JD versus approved from the court? Yes.
Well, with a preliminary JD, you can get a response from the court a lot quicker at times. And if it's not controversial, you can probably go with that for your project.
Yes, that's what we see as a primary advantage too. We said that it's a lot quicker and you can get an answer quicker. All we're saying is that there may be waters of the U.S. on the site. Some of the other advantages we see is they're non-binding. That means that if you have another project in the future, same resource, but you have more time and you'd like to see if it's actually, you want to get an approved determination, that's good for 5 years, then you can do that if you have the time. That's the advantage. The preliminary JD does not weigh into that. Another advantage of preliminary JD is approved JDs are appealable by the landowner affected, not necessarily, not just the person who is applying for the permit if that's not the landowner. So we have an obligation to get a hold of that landowner and give them appeal rights either then or later when that landowner might want to undertake an activity that would affect that same resource. Those are appealable to the landowner. Another reason that we like the preliminary JD. Disadvantage, it doesn't say a whole lot, it just says there may be waters. It is, and there's not a lot of documentation to them. So they're just a preliminary determination. Now approved JDs, anyone see an advantage other than what I said already of the approved? One obvious one. If it's approved JD says it's not a water US, then you don't have to deal with the core at that point. So I think that would be one advantage. Of course, they're good for 5 years. That would be another advantage. They require sufficient documentation to show that they truly are waters of the U.S. How long they take to do depends on adjacency and what they're adjacent to. Adjacent to traditional navigable waters is fairly easy, straightforward. The further away that you get from the TNW, the harder it gets. And this is where my two folks in the corner are going to start to get nervous because they don't know what else. I might say what they might have to bail me out of. So I'm not going to say much except that there are two categories that have to have higher level review: isolated determinations and significant nexus determinations. Has anybody here been through that process with us? Oh, yep, 1, 2, good. So you know what I'm talking about. Please feel free to add your own observations. I gotta go switch up to okay, documentation requirements. I just wanted to make sure that everybody's aware that we have guidance to applicants and agents on what information to provide when you're out in the field that would help us with jurisdictional determinations. It's on our website. There's the location of the address. Those isolated and significant nexus, you can see the review time frames there. They do have to go, we do have to wait. Once we complete them, we have to send them, we send them out for review and we have to wait. Okay, so then there's an elevation process. If the EPA takes issue with our determination, usually when we're saying something is not a wild US, they have 15 days to decide whether to elevate. They can notify us that they're going to elevate. Then there's 10 more days to try to resolve it between our district engineer and the regional administrator. If that doesn't work, then additional steps happen, and ultimately, at the end of about 51 days, we'll get an answer, and it'll be EPA's answer. So ultimately, through that process, EPA decides in the end what's a water to us, and that's what we do. So I want to give a few examples. You really have to stay away from that. I'm just going to stay over here. Okay, so this one. This is just an example of a typical isolated JD that we email sent to headquarters, stating what it is, the number where it is, and then the EPA can act on it or not act on it. If they do not act on it within the prescribed time frame, then it does become final. Okay. This is a more unique example. This particular JD was for a water that was not relatively permanent. It had a high gradient and no adjacent wetlands. We were fairly confident that it was not a WAGU-S, and you can see the response that we got. Now this is another, for us, for our resources, it's another drawback of an approved JD is that the staff need to stop, answer questions in hopes to resolve the issue so that it does not get elevated and take additional time to resolve. So this is another consequence and resource. We do it, it's our job. It does take a little bit longer when we need to stop and answer questions. Leads me to another point I wanted to make. The more thorough we are on our jurisdiction determinations, the more we provide thorough information, the more trust we have with the reviewers, the less likelihood we're going to get undue scrutiny. So we build a relationship just like you do with your clients and your communities. We build that relationship. The more trustworthy we are, the more likely we are to have our decisions stand. It's just kind of goes through all of the work we do. Okay, so here's an example of a jurisdictional determination that was appealed. Does anybody see a problem with what the decision was and the remand back with the time frames and what we were required to do? Anyone? Throw it out there. They asked us to go collect, go document volume, duration, and frequency of water flow. They asked us to do that in November. They asked to provide that data by January. We didn't do it. We said, we're sorry, it's not possible. We just strengthened our administrative record and reiterated that it was jurisdictional. Okay, so here's what I really wanted to talk about mostly today is our permit timeframes. And I think you're all familiar with our different types of permits, the general and the abbreviated individual, which is a letter of permission. That is an individual permit, it's just abbreviated, and our individual permits. These are our new timeframes. This is what we're looking at when we look at our data, we run our data. These are the timeframes that we're dealing with. So please plan ahead. 90 days for your GP, 6 months for your LOP, and 8 months for an IP. Another point, please discuss your schedule. If you have a schedule, if you know a construction date, a planned construction date, please share that and ask the core staff, you know, what would the companion permit review time frame be? Is there a problem right off the bat? You know, the project manager should at least be able to tell you if it looks like that's a manageable time frame that you're looking at. Some recommendations, definitely pre-application consultation. You can do it in person or by phone. Please identify all the resources regardless of whether they appear to be a jurisdictional water or an artificial water. Just identify them all and we'll deal with them. There is guidance. Ms. Myra Walther has put out updated guidance on delineations, and that's on her website. And please submit a complete application, provide as much detail as possible. We do have a checklist for those that might want to use it. We do have a checklist out there. It's actually a road permit guide, but the checklist that is with the guide is applicable to all. So in summary, coordinate with us as early as possible. Consider time frames associated with your JDs, with our JDs, and your JD requests. Be aware of the headquarters and EPA procedures and time frames. Ask for a schedule, share your schedule, and ask for a schedule from us. And finally, there's some core contacts in the trailer. Questions? I'd be happy to take questions before we jump into the rule and the interpretive rule, unless that's what you're all here for. Yes.
there's been, I guess, some concern with, I had a project and suddenly we were starting to consider whether we needed to look at stormwater mapping for delineations and this national hydrology database, which I'm pretty sure isn't complete yet. But it sounds like we're beginning to look at other avenues where water is flowing across the site, and those may be considered even in delineations. Is that correct?
Well, I believe you're talking about looking at data sets for adjacency.
Right.
This is where I asked the smarter ones that are with me today to help me.
Well, that's not you. I'm not sure I understand your question, but I think what you're saying is recently we've been asking for the delineators or the public to identify all the aquatic resources in a review area. And that's not to say we're going to assert jurisdiction over those, but when we look at making jurisdictional determinations, all those other resources come into play when we're looking at things. So in lieu of you just identifying wetlands and then us trying to figure out what other features may be on the site, jurisdictional or not jurisdictional, getting us all that information up front helps us make the decisions when you submit the information to us. We focused for years on just doing wetland delineations, and we realized that means a lot of people are just overlooking all the other features, the ditches or drainage swales or tributaries, potential tributaries. We need to know all that stuff to do JDs. So it's just helpful for us if you just mark them on a map and then let us apply the policy to those.
Okay.
Thank you. And if you don't provide it and we don't submit it with one of those two categories, we'll be asked for it anyway. We'll have to go back and get it. Yes, Jim?
Yeah, I think EPA has gone into rulemaking where they're proposing a definition for waters of the U.S. Is that going to, how is that going to affect this whole process if it actually goes through?
Okay. Well, now I get to turn it over to Des.
So we'll just hold that thought for a second. Because I wanted to just ask the one example of the, they asked for an AJD, an approved JD in November.
Right.
What is an alternative?
Thank you, Barbara. I asked her to remind me if I didn't mention that. The either or idea, the idea of an either preliminary or an approved. We've had situations where folks have started, they've kind of waffled back and forth whether they want a preliminary or an approved. We can go through, the guidance says to continue the permit process while working on an approved JD. We can proceed with a preliminary. We do have to have something. We've got to say, at least in order to put out a public notice, we have to say we made a preliminary determination that there are waters to us. Otherwise, we have no business doing a public notice. And so what happens is sometimes if a project manager is told, no, I don't want a preliminary JD, I want an approved JD, well, that permit review gets set aside. And it might get set aside for 6 months while they wait to get an approved JD done. That's something to think about for your clients. Is timing important where you may ultimately want an approved JD, but maybe for the particular action, maybe it's only a general permit. Maybe you don't want, it's non-binding, so maybe you just want to get through, or it's a very lengthy permit process, you want it to move along, you start with the preliminary while an approved is underway. So thank you, Barbara, for reminding me. Yes?
Is there a location where you've got the timeline that you talked about, the GP, LOP, individual permits? I think a lot of our clients are going to be a little bit shocked to see the length of time, and we're going to have to actually show it to them so they believe us.
Yes. The press release will probably go out today with that same information in it for Wetlands Month. But yes, that information will be publicly available on our website, and you could print it and show it to your clients. But that's very same information will go out. I expect to get some feedback on that. Yes.
I'm just wondering, are approved JDs appealable, and if so, what is the process for that?
Yes, so approved JDs are appealable. They are appealed to our Mississippi Valley Division, and what they will do is they will not make a decision one way or the other. What they'll do is they'll review it to see if it was done in accordance with all the applicable guidance and regulations. if they see a need as the one I showed, they saw a need for further documentation, so they remanded it back. So the appeal process is essentially just to have another higher level review to tell us whether we did a sufficient job or not. And then we do it, we apply whatever they've asked us to do, and we supplement the record, and we either make the same decision or change the decision based on the feedback, and then that decision stands. So it isn't really an external review, it's a review internal to the court that allows you to have a second set of eyes that really are not here. They're reviewing those. They would review jurisdictional determinations all up and down the Mississippi Valley. Okay, well, we better get going so we can cover the next two parts. Oh, yes.
One thing I noticed recently is that some areas got real busy, some counties, and then there were some projects that kind of got shuffled around. And I'm just wondering, it sounds like we might be going to a longer review period for some projects. And so we'll probably be going back to where we have one main county project manager contact, and there won't be as much shifting around of projects. Is that true? Or do you anticipate continuing to shift projects around the world?
That's a very good question. It's about how we're managing resources. We have been losing people fairly regularly, and since we assign work by geographic area, that leaves quite a hole. And so what happens is then the remaining project managers pick up that additional areas, or we reassign staff who don't normally work in permit evaluations and we assign them in. That probably will continue to happen. It's really unfortunate. We are recruiting, we will be hiring, but it will never be at the level we did have. So thank you for the question. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Des.
I'm going to try. I have not handouts, but some notes to sort of guide me, so I'm going to try not to use this. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I was hearing everybody's questions, so hopefully, is my voice projecting to the back? Yes, okay, thank you. To answer your question, yes, there is a proposed rule out in the Federal Register. It's not just an EPA proposal. This is a joint EPA and Corps proposal to clarify what waters are waters of the United States subject to Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and also other sections of the Clean Water Act, like 303, 311, 401, 402. I think that's the list. Does it sound like I missed any? So this definition of waters will apply to all applicable sections of the Clean Water Act. It is out for public comment until April the 21st. Sorry, it was published on April 21st, out through July. The video recorders make me a little nervous. I didn't know I was going to be on video today. I'm going to try not to do anything to go viral. We'll do my best. The docket number that you guys can provide comment until July 21st too is provided here on the screen. Tamara, if you can just switch a couple slides up.
Sure.
Yeah. Next one. Okay. So this is the only slide that I have regarding the proposal for defining waters of the U.S. I just kind of want to talk through the proposal with you guys. So how many of you have already gone to the Federal Register and taken a look? Okay, so the minority of you. Okay, so the first thing I recommend that you do, if you do want to get familiar with the proposal, if you do want to comment on the proposal, go ahead and go to the Federal Register. The link is provided on the EPA web pages and on the Corps web pages. Just for your reference, it is at volume 79, beginning on page 22188. Again, published on April 21st, so if you Google for that information, you'll probably be able to find it pretty easily. So I would recommend that you take a look. The first thing, if I were you, that I would do is go straight to the definition and what we're proposing to do differently in 328.3 in comparison to how 328.3 right now defines waters of the U.S. So you can find that information on 22262. That's the page number of the Federal Register where you'll see that these are the waters, these are the categories of waters that are proposed to be waters that are protected under the Clean Water Act. There are 6 categories, the first 6 that will be jurisdictional by rule under this proposal. The 7th category, if waters fall within that category, they will be jurisdictional on a case-specific basis, depending on the specific analysis associated with the facts of that site. Just going through each of the categories, I guess actually before I do that, I should clarify that the purpose of this rule is to clarify what waters are subject to Clean Water Act jurisdiction, what waters are not subject to Clean Water Act jurisdiction. So most of you probably already know that our waters are defined at 328.3. 328.3A includes a list currently of waters that are and are not subject to Clean Water Act jurisdiction. So the new proposal under 328.3A will provide for these 7 categories of waters, and 328.3B will clarify all of those waters that are not waters of the U.S. So we'll talk a little bit more about those waters that are not waters under the rule in a little bit, but we'll go through this list first. So the purpose is to clarify, again, like I said, what are waters, what are not. We hope that this will provide increased clarity and predictability for the regulated public, will improve protection to aquatic resources, and we work to ensure that the proposal is consistent with the intent of the Clean Water Act statute, incorporates relevant case law like the Rapano Supreme Court decision, and is based on applicable and available science to the extent that we have available to us. Associated with this rule is a connectivity report that has been drafted and prepared by the EPA. They've been working on this report for quite some time. They've been working with their Science Advisory Board to collect and compile all of the available science on the connectivity of wetlands and streams to downstream waters. So if you're interested in all the science that went behind the rule, a summary of that is provided as a part of this Federal Register. It's I think it might be this first appendix. Sorry. So starting Appendix A, scientific evidence, on page 22222. 5 twos in a row is your Federal Register page number to see the summary of the scientific evidence that supports the proposal. And again, if you want more detail, the connectivity report itself is about 325 pages, I think. So you can find that on the EPA's webpage if you're interested in those details. The legal analysis that supports the rule is Appendix B, starting on page 22252, if you're interested in the legal analysis that supports the proposal. So just briefly, the first 3 categories of waters, there's no difference in these 3 categories from the existing regulation found at our regs right now at 328.3. So these A1, A2, and A3 waters have always been waters of the U.S. and will continue to be waters of the U.S. under this proposed rule. Navigable waters, of course, those that have been in the past are now or could be susceptible for use in the future for navigation, the territorial seas, and all interstate waters, including wetlands. You probably don't have a lot of questions about those 3 because they're fairly obvious waters of the U.S. I'll pause and see. Do you have any questions before we get into the other categories? Okay. So starting with category 4, so this is the proposal for 328.3A4. So the A4 waters are all impoundments of waters identified in subsections 1 through 3 and section 5, or category 5 of this section. Again, this is very much like the existing regulation. The next category is different than the existing regulation. So the existing regulation speaks to tributaries of waters. This regulation proposes that all tributaries of waters identified in the categories 1 through 4 and category 5 will be waters of the U.S. By rule under this proposal. So basically what this means, we further define tributary in the proposed rule so that there is clarity about what a tributary is. Essentially, tributaries are those waters that convey flow to downstream waters in these other categories. Tributaries are characterized by an ordinary high water mark and a bed and a bank. There's clarification in the tributary definition that is proposed that if there is a man-made or a natural break in the tributary, that doesn't take away jurisdiction, provided there are still those distinguishing features upstream of that natural or man-made break. So things like culverts, dams, natural debris, natural boulders, if a stream were to go underground for a certain short period of time or a certain distance, those kinds of factors would not take away jurisdiction, provided that those distinguishing features are still present upstream. Tributaries will include, under the rule, under the proposed rule, all intermittent, perennial, and ephemeral tributaries. Some ditches will be included, others will not, under this proposal. And I should make sure that I clarify. If I ever say during the discussion that a certain water will be a water of the U.S., please understand that all of this is proposed. All of this is out for public comment. None of this is final yet. So until such time that the rule is finalized and a final rule is issued in the public or in the Federal Register, determinations of waters of the U.S. will continue to be made consistent with the practices that Tamara described. So we'll be continuing to implement guidance under the Rapanos guidance, and all of this is proposed at this time until public comment is received, incorporated, and addressed. So for, let's see if I wanted to say anything else. Do you guys have any questions with respect to tributaries and the potential for some ditches to be tributaries, some ditches to not be tributaries? There is clarification in the preamble about which ditches would not be waters and not be a tributary. Those are the kinds of ditches that are constructed in upland, draining only upland, and having less than perennial flow, or those ditches that do not contribute flow to one of the A1 through A3, one of the A1 through 4 waters. So if you have a ditch like that, it is not going to be a water of the U.S. under the tributary category. If you have a ditch that has been created as a result of relocating a natural channel, if you have a ditch that has been constructed in a water of the U.S., if you have a ditch with perennial flow, then those are the kinds of characteristics of ditches that will cause them to be captured into this tributary category. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
So a ditch has to be cut through an upland, and it can't go to any of the first 3 water bodies to not be jurisdiction.
Right. Yes. So in 328.3b is the clarification of what's proposed for waters that are not waters of the U.S. So constructed in upland, draining only upland, less than perennial flow, or not contributing flow to one of the A1 through A4 waters.
So they're kind of dropping this idea of a relatively permanent, seasonal, 1 seasonal, 3 months, however you want it.
Right. The relatively permanent
That was all the difficult concept.
It has been a very difficult concept, and we know we've been relying on perennial intermittent and flow determinations for many, many years. We believe that the agencies and the public are very familiar with what those terms mean, how to define streams with those flow designations in the field. So we think that there will be more clarity for the public and more consistent implementation if we rely on those perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral flow designations rather than that relatively permanent.
So for example, if you had a intermittently flowing ditch through an upland soil unit that only carried water from an isolated wetland to a tributary wetland during the spring, such that that area was not have wetland characteristics, but it did carry flow from that isolated wetland to that tributary wetland. Would that make that whole, under the proposed rule, would that make that whole thing jurisdictional?
It depends. I'm going to try to be careful not to answer too many hypotheticals because there's so many variables that can go into the on-the-ground facts. But if a ditch connects to waters, then the ditch will become jurisdictional as a tributary under this category. But I kind of just have to fall back on those descriptions in 328.3b, or if it's constructed in uplands, draining only uplands, and less than perennial flow, or if it doesn't contribute flow to one of the A1 through A4 categories of waters, then those types of ditches would not be waters. And I'm sure, as if As this is implemented, when a rule is finalized, we'll be faced with those unique specific site circumstances, and we'll work through application of the rule at that time. Any other questions right now?
Yeah, I was curious how jurisdictional determinations will proceed before this decision is made, especially given that the permitting process can take up to 8 months, and we'll have a decision before then. So will it be based on this middle date, or will it be based on whenever it's processed?
So you're asking about timeframes for verifications
Right,
under the
this is
existing.
actually changing what's considered jurisdictional, so how will those determine if the rules change before your permit process?
So your question relates to if your application comes to us
Right.
and we're evaluating it consistent with our current procedures, and then the rule is finalized, and how might that alter the way that your application is evaluated? It's a very good question. I'm hesitant to give too much of a very specific answer right now, but your question makes us realize we need to make sure we know the answer. So we'll definitely work on those types of scenarios. It's a very important question. Thank you.
Just, you probably can't answer this either, but to what extent is groundwater connection going to be included into a significant?
So there is a proposal to include shallow subsurface flow, and the connection of shallow subsurface waters to tributary systems to support adjacency determinations. That is part of the proposal for adjacent waters, which we'll get to, and
Okay.
we are requesting comment on that. So if there's no more questions on tributaries, we'll go to the adjacency, that next category, okay? Okay, so the A6 category of waters, these are all waters, including wetlands, adjacent to a water identified in any of the previous subsections, 1 through 5. Sorry, I'm going to trip myself. That may get me on YouTube. Hopefully not. So this category, the A6 waters, are proposed to be jurisdictional by rule. This is a new category. In the existing 328 regulation, the adjacency category relates to wetlands that are adjacent to waters. This particular category that's proposed will be all waters, including wetlands, that are adjacent to one of the other waters identified in this section. So this is going to be wetlands, lakes, ponds, any waters that are adjacent to those other categories of waters. The definition of adjacent is proposed not to change and will continue to be defined as neighboring, bordering, or contiguous. For those of you who have been familiar with working with adjacency determinations, we all know that it's been difficult to interpret and define what neighboring means. So we have in the proposed rule proposed a definition for neighboring and also related definitions for floodplain and riparian area. So in this proposal, we do propose that waters that are in the floodplain or in the riparian area of a water will be adjacent. We further propose that neighboring wetlands outside of the floodplain or the riparian area can be determined to be adjacent if they are connected to that water via a discrete surface flow connection or via a shallow subsurface groundwater connection. And we're requesting comment on that proposal. I should be clear, we're requesting comment on the entirety of the rule, but there are very specific places throughout the Federal Register where you'll see that we're specifically requesting comments on certain parts of the rule. So with respect to adjacency, we are requesting comment on whether or not we should establish a certain geographic limit beyond which, a distance outside of the floodplain or riparian area, we should not be making determinations of adjacency, even if there is that shallow subsurface connection or discrete surface connection. We're asking for input on whether or not the floodplain boundaries should be determined based on a specific flood event. Right now, the proposal does not rely on a specific flood event, but we're asking you for comment on whether or not it should, for increased predictability or for scientifically valid reasons. We're asking, let me think, there's a number of seven or eight specific comments that we're asking on options with respect to the adjacency category. These are on page 22208 in the Federal Register. So if you want to refer to that discussion on the category related to adjacency, and see the questions that we're asking and the input that we're asking for, please consider if you do want to comment on those different options.
It seems that if we had a stormwater pond constructed in the upland and it was connected by a culvert to a tributary wetland, that would then become jurisdictional. Under the proposal.
So if it, again, I hate to answer any hypotheticals because there could be something about that hypothetical that I'm not fully considering on the spot at the moment. So I think it's probably best for me not to answer any hypotheticals.
Sure.
Right.
It's kind of a broader hypothetical with reference to establishing a shallow subsurface connection with shallow groundwater. How do you foresee sort of documenting that in the field or documenting that the groundwater connection does not exist, and how, practically speaking, would that be established or,
Okay. Yes. So the question relates to how information can be collected to support the presence of a shallow groundwater connection, that shallow subsurface connection. So in the proposed rule, there's some options presented as the type of information that you might be able to collect related to the stream hydrograph, soil survey data, information on whether or not the water table in the stream is lower than the adjacent area. So those types of factors could be collected and presented to assess whether or not there is or is not that shallow subsurface connection. We do also, though, ask for comments on whether or not a shallow subsurface connection should or should not be used to support an adjacency determination. So we're opening that up for your comment with respect to whether or not that's an appropriate factor to rely upon when making the adjacency determination.
Does that whole definition include tile as a conveyance of shallow groundwater?
I don't believe that the tile is specifically addressed in the preamble. That's a question, though, that I can get back to you on. And you can certainly offer any questions or comments with respect to how that would or would not be used. Any other questions on adjacency? Yes.
What's your definition of shallow?
The shallow is not defined. So if, again, because we have offered lots of opportunity for folks to weigh in on the parameters that would be used to support an adjacency determination. If you believe there should be more definitive information to define the presence or absence of that characteristic, then please offer that in your comments. Any other questions on adjacency? Okay, so the next category, this is the only category of the 7 that is not proposed to be automatically jurisdictional by rule. So the A7 category are the other waters category. So these are waters that aren't captured in any of the previous 6 categories. These are waters that will be jurisdictional if, on a case-specific basis, the water in question is determined to either alone or in combination with other similarly situated waters have a significant nexus to the navigable waterway to which it flows. Right now, under the existing 328 rule, the other waters category is found at 328.3A3. And the part of the regulation at 328.3A3 is proposed to be eliminated in this rule and replaced by this A7 category of waters. This category is based substantially on the Justice Kennedy significant nexus information that came out of the Rapano Supreme Court decision. So you guys are probably, to some degree at least, familiar with Justice Kennedy's significant nexus standard that was established as a result of that Supreme Court decision. In his significant nexus standard, he assessed that if waters had more than a speculative or insubstantial effect on the navigable waterways to which they flowed, then they do have a significant nexus and should be considered waters of the U.S. subject to protection. So connected to the A7 category is a proposed definition for significant nexus, so that there is clarity about what that means. The definition establishes that if a water alone or in combination with similarly situated waters has more than an insubstantial or speculative effect on the A1 through A3 waters to which it flows, then that is a water of the U.S. subject to Clean Water Act jurisdiction. Pivotal to the evaluation and the consideration of whether or not waters can be aggregated for the significant nexus evaluation is determining which waters are similarly situated. Under the definition of significant nexus, there is information that similarly situated waters have similar functions and are sufficiently closely located that they can be aggregated and looked at collectively when evaluating their effects on a navigable water, interstate water, or the territorial seas. What we're looking at doing, even with the definition of significant nexus, it may be still difficult to assess which waters are similarly situated and can therefore be aggregated for purposes of a significant nexus evaluation. So we are proposing a number of different options to make that, that determination of which waters can be aggregated a little bit more simple, but still based on relevant science. So what we're proposing and what we want to comment on is using the OMERNIC's classification system. So there's information on this in the Federal Register. We're proposing to rely on his ecosystem level 3 classifications. So these ecosystems have been defined based on similarities in physiography, geology, vegetation, soils, hydrology. There's about 105, I think, of these ecoregions in the continental U.S. There's about 25 of those that we are proposing in this proposal as regions where waters are similarly situated and could be aggregated for purposes of making a significant nexus evaluation. For you guys in Minnesota, does everybody here work in Minnesota only, or do you guys do Wisconsin as well? Just Minnesota?
North Dakota, Wisconsin, and Minnesota.
Okay. Okay. So I only have the information on the Minnesota ecoregions that are proposed for aggregation. But the majority of the state is comprised of ecoregions that are proposed to be used for the purposes of aggregating similarly situated waters. So the northern glaciated plains, western Corn Belt plains, Lake Agassiz Plain, northern lakes and forests, and the north central hardwood forests are all of the level 3 ecoregions that are proposed to be aggregated for purposes of significant nexus evaluation. So there's just one little portion down in the southeast part of the state, in the driftless region, and one little portion that has a little bit of, I think, Roseau and Coochin County up in the north that aren't in these ecoregions. So essentially what this proposal would afford is the ability to aggregate similarly situated waters in wetlands, in watersheds for the purposes of that significant nexus evaluation. So all other waters in one watershed would be looked at collectively for the effect that they have on the navigable water that they flow to. Yes?
How do you partition out the effect of the wetland of interest from this much larger supersphere of similarly situated wetlands?
Right. So the question is, how do you separate out the functions of the one particular wetland of interest from all of the rest of the wetlands? It's a very good question.
Really focusing on the effect of the chemical integrity of traditional navigable water to which that water is discharged.
Right. So what you're focusing on is the effect of the water in question on the chemical, physical, biological integrity of the navigable system to which it flows. So under this proposed, under the proposal to utilize the ecosystems and the classifications for purposes of aggregating, the proposal suggests that 25 ecoregions in the country are characterized by waters that are similarly situated and do have similar function and can therefore be aggregated. So if your project, for example, is in the Lake Agassiz Plain, if you have one wetland that is in other water, one wetland that isn't in any of your first 6 categories, so you have one wetland that's being evaluated, for jurisdictional purposes in the Lake Agassiz Plain, we would look at the watershed that one wetland or other water is located in. And we would look collectively at the rest of the other waters like that water in that particular watershed that drains to the navigable waterway for purposes of assessing collectively what the entire function and effect is on all of those waters to the navigable waterway.
What was the goal of this? What was the reason for this? Why did they?
The reason for proposing
The
this.
7, yes.
So the rationale behind the categories is found in those appendices, the legal background, the science background. So all of that goes into the relevant case law and all of the relevant science that supports the proposal. It'd be much too complicated of an answer to provide right now.
Let's see if we can throw it simple.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say. Do you guys have other questions about the A7 proposal? I should also say that in addition to the ecoregion level 3 classification system, there is also a proposal to rely upon hydrologic classifications in association with assessing which waters can be aggregated for purposes of a significant nexus evaluation. So I refer you to the proposal to see the details of that. We are looking for your comment on whether or not there are other ways that we could assess which other waters are similarly situated for purposes of aggregation. We are looking to you for comment on whether or not the ecosystem level 3 classification system is appropriate, if there are ecoregions that have been proposed to support aggregation that shouldn't be, or if there are some of those ecoregions from the list of 105 that aren't on the list that ought to be on the list. Please take a look at that and see if there are comments that you want to provide with respect to that particular part of the proposal. The other part of the other waters category that we're asking for comment on, one of the options is to propose that certain categories of waters are automatically jurisdictional or automatically not jurisdictional. It may not be as relevant in this region, but just for your awareness, there is a proposal to, for example,